All right, let's go. Number 10. Xiphactinus audax. In 1952, a crew working the chalk badlands of Gove County, Kansas, cut a block out of a hillside and hauled it back to Fort Hays. George Sternberg led the excavation. His family had been pulling fossils out of that chalk since the 1870s, and by then he could read its surface the way a farmer reads soil. What came out of the block after cleaning is cataloged as FHSM VP 333. It sits today in the Sternberg Museum of Natural History, and it is probably the most reproduced fossil ever found in North America. It is a fish roughly 4 meters long. The jaws are long and upturned. Edward Drinker Cope, who described the same animal under a different name in 1871, wrote that its muzzle was shorter and deeper than a bulldog's. The teeth are conical and wildly uneven in size. The largest stand about 7 centimeters clear of the jaw, and 2 crossed fangs sit at the front of the mouth on each side. Around 85 vertebrae run back to a deeply forked tail. Inside its ribcage is another fish. Not fragments. Not a scatter of bone in the gut region. A complete articulated Gillicus arcuatus, close to 2 meters long, lying head first inside the body cavity of the animal that swallowed it, with almost nothing digested. What makes this specimen unlike almost every other fossil of a large predator is that it is not a portrait. It is a timestamp. Digestion in a fish that size is measured in hours. The prey is intact. That means the predator died almost immediately after the meal, and the chalk closed over both of them before anything came to scavenge. The usual reading is that the swallowed fish was still struggling and ruptured something vital on the way down. That is an interpretation, not a demonstration. What the bones prove is the timing. The chalk explains why any of it survived. This is the Smoky Hill chalk, part of the Niobrara Formation, laid down about 85 million years ago on the floor of the Western Interior Seaway. That sea ran from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, more than 3,000 kilometers long and up to 970 kilometers wide, and for something like 30 million years, it cut North America into 2 separate islands. Over Kansas, the water was at least 150 to 200 meters deep. The bottom was quiet, low in oxygen, and almost empty of anything that burrowed. Sediment settled there at roughly a 36th of a millimeter a year. A carcass that reached that floor was not torn apart. It was buried, 1 hair's breadth at a time. Xiphactinus could not bite pieces off anything. The jaw seizes and holds. It does not shear. Prey went down whole and went down alive. A 2020 analysis by Humberto Ferrin argued from body proportions and metabolic modeling that the fish ran warmer than the water around it, the way a tuna or a mako does. That is one study and a modeled result, but it fits the shape of the animal, and the shape is the shape of something built for pursuit. It was not the top of that sea either. At least 2 specimens record Cretoxyrhina feeding on Xiphactinus, a shark of comparable size that could bite pieces off. The 2 fish are still in the same block, in the same posture, in a museum in Hays, Kansas. One is inside the other. Everything about that afternoon is gone, except the last decision the larger animal made, and the chalk kept that. It is an extraordinary thing to have. It is also, in the strictest sense, an accident. Number 9. The armored fish with no teeth. The cliffs at Sheffield Lake, on the Ohio shore of Lake Erie, are black shale. A local collector named J. Terrell found bone weathering out of them in 1867. The material reached John Strong Newberry of the Ohio Geological Survey, who named the animal Dinictis terrelli in 1875. It was moved into a new genus in 1956 and renamed Dunkleosteus, after David Dunkel, a curator at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. The rock is the Cleveland Shale. It is about 360 million years old, and it formed on an anaerobic seafloor, which is the only reason the bone is there at all. The animal is a placoderm, from the first great radiation of jawed vertebrates, and the front third of it was sealed inside interlocking plates of bony armor. The rest was cartilage. That matters later. It had no teeth. Not one. In any specimen, ever. Where teeth should be, there are gnathal plates, the jaw bones themselves, drawn out into fangs at the front and long shearing blades behind. Upper and lower plates ground against each other every time the mouth closed. The museum that holds the type material describes the effect plainly. The jaws sharpen themselves as the animal used them. In 2007, Philip Anderson and Mark Westneat published a mechanical model of that skull in Biology Letters. They found a 4-bar linkage inside the head, a closed loop of skull, lower jaw, thoracic shield, and jaw muscle, hinged at a joint between the back of the skull and the armor behind it. That joint exists in placoderms and nowhere else in the history of vertebrates. Its effect was to throw the skull backwards and the jaw forwards at the same moment, so the lower jaw rotated at 3 times the speed of the motion driving it. The mouth reached full gape in 20 milliseconds. A human blink takes 5 times longer. Their model returned over 4,400 newtons at the fang tips and over 5,300 at the rear blades. And because those fangs are narrow, the pressure where they met flesh came out around 147 megapascals. For a long time, that was the animal. 9 meters of armor, the strongest bite in the sea, the first true monster of the fossil record. But here's where it starts coming apart. In 2023, Russell Engelman pointed out that every published length for Dunkleosteus rested on scaling from small, distantly related fish or from mouth width in living sharks, with no statistical test behind it. Arthrodires are not shaped like sharks. They are short, deep, and barrel-bodied, with mouths enormous relative to everything behind them. So a shark-derived equation reads that mouth and returns a body that never existed. Engelman worked from the head instead. He put the famous Cleveland specimen at about 3.4 meters, and the largest individual known at roughly 4.1. The older figures had run from 6 meters to nearly 9. The animal shrank by half. The argument is recent, and it is not finished. The Cleveland Museum still quotes the wide range on its own pages, but it lands on the bite as well, because those Newton figures were calculated for an assumed 6-meter, 1-ton animal. Have the animal, and the numbers follow it down. Then, in late 2025, a team led by Engelman published the first close study of the jaw anatomy since 1932. Nearly half the skull, they found, had been cartilage, including most of the major joints and muscle attachments. On that reading, it was a ram feeder that drove forward onto prey and dismembered it with the blades, rather than the suction feeder earlier work had implied. The pattern is the point. Everything anyone said with confidence about this animal came from the parts that happened to mineralize. The placoderms are gone completely, wiped out at the end of the Devonian, around 359 million years ago. Not one of them survived into the Carboniferous. No animal alive today carries that jaw joint or that armor. What survives of the first great armored predator is armor, and armor is the part of a body that says least about how it lived. Number 8. Helicoprion. The object is a spiral. It sits in a slab of Permian rock, a flat coil of teeth turning in on itself, the largest known example 56 centimeters across. The teeth are triangular and serrated. They run continuously from the small worn ones at the center of the coil out to the tall ones at the rim, more than 130 of them, all mounted on one root. They were never shed. That is the first strange fact. In a shark, teeth are a conveyor belt, grown and discarded for a lifetime. This animal added new teeth at the outer edge and kept every tooth it had ever grown, spiraling the old ones inward. A whorl is a complete dental biography. Birth to death in one piece, still articulated. Alexander Karpinski named it in 1899 from Russian material and said, carefully, that he could not determine its function. He suggested it curled forward out of the upper jaw. In 1911, he changed his mind and drew it as part of the dorsal fin. Others put it on the pectoral fins. Others buried it in the body as a defensive structure, or set it inside the cheeks in pairs, or coiled it in the throat as a swallowing aid. And every one of those versions was published in good faith by a serious person looking at the same fossil. A trading card illustrator in the mid-20th century drew it as an external buzzsaw hanging off the chin, and that is the image the world remembers. For over a century, nobody could say where on the animal the only part of it we possessed actually belonged. What shape is a creature known only by its mouth? And then it was settled by a hospital scanner. In 2013, Livyatan and Jesse Pruitt of Idaho State University, with colleagues in France and the United States, published CT scans in the journal Biology Letters. The specimen had been collected in 1950 from a phosphate mine near Montpelier, Idaho. It was unremarkable to look at. It still had rock around the whorl, and inside that rock were the mineralized ghosts of cartilage. The whorl sat in the lower jaw, not on it, in it. It was the entire lower dentition, running the full length of the mandibular arch, braced along the midline, and buttressed by a slab of cartilage on each side. The upper jaw carried no cutting teeth at all, only a pavement of small rounded ones for the whorl to work against. And the way the jaw hung from the brain case put the animal outside the sharks altogether, far down the branch that leads to the modern chimeras, the ratfish. The mechanism came 2 years later from a study of the jaw muscles. The whorl does not spin. The lower jaw rotates, and the teeth sweep through curved paths as it does, which means the same row of blades performs 3 different jobs depending on where a tooth sits in the spiral. The teeth at the front hook prey and drag it inward. The middle teeth pierce and cut. The rear teeth push what is left down the throat. It was a mouth that swallowed by cutting, and the authors compared the paths those crowns traveled to the arc of a drawn blade. The diet is an inference, and an honest one. There are no gut contents. There is no bitten prey. What there is an absence of wear on the crowns, and a geometry that would let a hard shell slide forward off the curve instead of breaking against it. Soft-bodied cephalopods fit that. Nothing else fits it as well, in a Permian sea full of them. Here is what we still do not have. No skull beyond those traces of cartilage. No spine. No fin. No tail. No scale. No body of any kind, from any specimen, anywhere in the world. Every length ever published for this animal, from 5 meters to something over 9, is extrapolated from the diameter of a coil of teeth. And it does not end in a catastrophe. Helicoprion disappears from the record around 270 million years ago, with no mass extinction to explain it, in the ordinary way that most species end. We have its mouth in detail, tooth by tooth, across the whole of its life. We have never seen the animal. That gap is the haunting part, because the whorl was only ever the hardest thing it owned. Number 7. The largest arthropod that ever lived. In late 2007, Simon Brady, Marcus Poschmann, and Eric Tetley published a short paper in Biology Letters with an unusually direct title. Giant Claw reveals the largest ever arthropod. The claw had come out of the Wilverath quarry near Prum in the Rhineland, from beds of the Clerf Formation laid down in the early Devonian, somewhere around 400 million years ago. The preserved piece measures 36 centimeters. About a quarter of its length is missing, and reconstructed whole it comes to roughly 46. That is 1 pincer. It is longer than most people's forearm. Scaled against the proportions of related animals, it implied a body around 2.5 meters. The following year, another team argued that figure was inflated and proposed something closer to 1.8. Even the low estimate is an arthropod the size of a person. These are eurypterids, usually called sea scorpions, which is a 19th century nickname rather than a description. They are chelicerates, the branch of the arthropod tree, whose surviving members are the horseshoe crabs and the arachnids. The body is flat and segmented, with a broad shield over the head, a tapering trunk, a paddle on each side for swimming, and a spike or a blade at the tail. They appear in the Ordovician and peak in the Silurian, and at that peak they included genuine open water hunters. Pterygotus, Cosmopolitan, an apex predator of late Silurian marine ecosystems, approaching 1.75 meters, and Acutaramus, which passed 2. Both lived in normal saltwater at a time when the largest fish in the sea were small enough to swallow whole. What makes this group unsettling is not the size. It is what 2 studies of their eyes found underneath the size. Compound eyes fossilize well enough to count individual lenses and measure the angle between them, and those 2 numbers together set a hard ceiling on how sharply an animal can see. In 2014, a team led by Ross Anderson measured Acutaramus. They found no region of enhanced acuity anywhere in the eye, and interlenses angles well outside the range of any modern visual hunter. By the standards of a predator, it was close to blind. In 2015, the same method applied to Xiphactinus returned the opposite result. Its eyes matched those of living predatory arthropods, with the lenses concentrated forward into an overlapping field. The claws split the same way. Acutaramus has thin slicing blades. Xiphactinus has heavy crushing ones. 2 animals in the same family, at the same scale, built on the same plan. One was a visual pursuit predator. The other hunted soft prey it could barely see, probably at night, probably in murky water. The lineage that produced the largest arthropod in the history of the planet was not a single strategy scaled up. It was several, and they diverged completely from each other. There is a limit built into all of them, and it is the reason nothing has matched this since. Every arthropod grows by shedding its entire skeleton. The old shell splits along the back. The animal drags itself out through the gap, and then it waits, soft and slack, and entirely defenseless, sometimes for days, while a new skeleton hardens around it. At 2 meters in water, in a world already filling with armored fish, that interval is very long and completely undefended. Size in an arthropod is not free. It is paid for once per molt, and the bill goes up with every centimeter. And there is a last reversal in it. The Klurf Formation, where the giant claw was found, was not open ocean. It was estuary and delta, brackish at best, and Xiphactinus fossils come from water that was partly or entirely fresh. Brady and his colleagues also concluded the animal was far too heavy to walk on land, which closes off the only other option. The largest arthropod that ever existed was not a sea scorpion at all. It had left the sea behind and gone up into the rivers. Number 6. The hunter they called Predator X. A volunteer named Bjorn Funke found bone weathering out of a mountainside on Spitsbergen in the summer of 2006, a few hundred kilometers from the North Pole. The site was Janus Filet. The rock was black shale of the Slotsmoya member, about 150 million years old, laid down on the floor of a cold Jurassic sea. The excavation the following summer was run by Jorn Hurum of the Natural History Museum in Oslo. It was one of 8 Arctic field seasons that eventually produced 60 marine reptile specimens from that valley. Pliosaurs are not dinosaurs and not fish. They are air-breathing reptiles with short necks, enormous heads, and 4 wing-shaped flippers. They flew through the water the way a sea turtle does. That flight is more interesting than it sounds. A robotic study of plesiosaur flippers in 2017 found something specific. If the rear pair is timed to beat into the vortices shed by the front pair, thrust rises by around 60%. A computer simulation 2 years earlier had concluded that the front flippers did nearly all of the work. The debate is live. What is not in question is that these animals kept 4 working wings for over 100 million years, which is not what evolution does with a useless pair. This one, the museum announced in 2008, was 15 meters long, weighed 45 tons, and bit with 4 times the force of Tyrannosaurus. It was nicknamed Predator X. A television documentary followed. Those numbers traveled around the world, and they are still in circulation today. Except the animal in the scientific paper is not the animal in the headlines. The formal description appeared in 2012 by Espen Knutsen, Patrick Druckenmiller, and Hurum, naming the species Pliosaurus funki after the volunteers who found it. The published length is 10 to 13 meters. There is no published mass. There is no bite force analysis in the paper at all, because there was never material to run one on. The bones had gone through years of Arctic freeze and thaw before anyone reached them, and they came out fragmentary. The authors themselves urged caution about drawing conclusions on pliosaur ecology from remains in that state. A specialist had said so publicly a year before publication, warning that the circulating estimates rested on a partial brain case and some neck vertebrae. He was right. This is not one museum getting carried away. It is the standard history of the entire group. The Kronosaurus mounted at Harvard is roughly a third plaster, assembled with too many vertebrae, and stands about 3 meters longer than the animal ever was. Paleontologists call it Plasterosaurus. The Mexican pliosaur reported in the press at 19 or 20 meters has since been assessed at 10 or 11. Every one of these animals was announced enormous and settled down smaller. And the settled versions are still 10-meter predators with 2-meter skulls, hunting other marine reptiles in open water, which ought to have been enough for anybody. The best of them came out of a cliff in Dorset. In 2022, a fossil hunter named Phil Jacobs found the tip of a snout lying at the base of the cliffs at Kimmeridge. The rest of the skull was still in the rock face, about 11 meters above the beach. Steve Etches and a team spent 3 weeks suspended on ropes, cutting it out in sections and lowering them down. What they recovered is a pliosaur skull, close to 2 meters long and very nearly complete, with sensory pits along the snout for detecting movement in the water and a crest of bone along the top of the head for the muscle that closed the jaw. That skull is now in a museum in the village where it was found. The body it belonged to is, as far as anyone can tell, still inside the cliff behind it. That coast erodes constantly, which is the only reason the head appeared at all, and the same process is now working on whatever is left. It will come out, or it will be destroyed on the way out. There is no third possibility. Number 5. The whale that hunted whales. There is a valley in the Egyptian desert, southwest of Cairo, and well beyond the last of the farmland, where more than 400 skeletons of ancient whales lie in the sand. It is called Wadi al-Hittan, the Valley of the Whales. UNESCO inscribed it as a World Heritage Site in 2005 for one reason. Nowhere else on Earth records the moment whales finished leaving the land so clearly. Working in the eastern part of the protected area in December 2010, a team recovered a skeleton catalogued as WH10001. It is an adult Basilosaurus isis, between 15 and 18 meters long, out of rock about 37.5 million years old. The animal has a badly chosen name. In 1834, Richard Harlan described a vertebra from Louisiana, decided it belonged to an enormous marine reptile, and called it Basilosaurus, king lizard. He guessed the creature had been 25 meters long or more. 5 years later, Richard Owen examined the teeth in London and saw that the molars had 2 roots. No fish does that. No reptile does that. It was a mammal, and Owen proposed a new name to say so. The rules of zoological naming give priority to whatever was published first, so the largest predatory whale of the Eocene is registered permanently as a lizard. It did not look like a modern whale. It had 70 vertebrae, and the ones through the back and the base of the tail are stretched into long, marrow-filled cylinders, giving it the body of a thick eel. It probably moved through the water in a way no living cetacean does. And it had legs. In 1989, Philip Gingerich's team found the first complete archaeocet hind limbs in this same desert and published them in Science the following year. A femur, a kneecap, an ankle, and 3 toes. The whole assembly is about 35 centimeters long, on an animal 16 meters from nose to tail. And it was not attached to the spine. It could not bear weight. It could not move the animal anywhere at all. The team suggested the limbs might have worked as guides during mating, and that suggestion, offered as a hypothesis, has been repeated as fact ever since. The truly disturbing part of this animal was inside its ribcage. In 2019, Manya Voss, Mohammed Sameh Antar, Ayad Zalmout, and Gingerich published the stomach contents of WWH10001 in PLOS 1. In the body cavity lay the bones of at least 2 juvenile Dorodon atrox, a smaller whale from the same sea, and the count of 2 rather than 1 rests on something very simple. There were 2 right frontal bones inside the same stomach. One jaw fragment still carried milk teeth, with the first molar only partly erupted. There were skull bones, an ear bone, vertebrae, and ribs. Alongside them lay a bony fish about a meter long. There was also a single shark tooth, which the authors read as scavenging on the dead Basilosaurus rather than as a meal it had eaten. Then they looked at the marks. On one juvenile skull bone, there is a conical puncture about 8 millimeters across and at least 8 millimeters deep, with 2 shallower marks beside it. Similar damage had been recorded before, on other young Dorodon from the same beds. Every bitten specimen is a juvenile. The bites cluster on the head. The reading is that the attacks were aimed at the skull, which is the fastest way to kill anything in water. A separate study in 2015 modeled the bite of a 16-meter Basilosaurus and returned over 16,000 newtons at the rear teeth, rising past 20,000 during the shearing phase of the bite. It is still the largest bite force ever estimated for any mammal, living or extinct. Dorodon matters here for a reason that has nothing to do with the fight. Basilosaurus, with its stretched eel-like body, is a specialist branch that ended. The line that leads to every whale and dolphin alive today runs through smaller, more ordinary animals, built like Dorodon. Both are lying in that valley, in their hundreds, in the same sandstone. And in one of them, the ancestors of the modern ocean are inside the ribcage of the thing that was eating them. Number 4. Livyatan melvillei. Klaus Post was walking the eroded slopes of a hill called Cerro Colorado in the Ica Desert of southern Peru on the last day of a field trip in November 2008. He noticed teeth in a weathered block. The site had produced fossil whales for years, and a large skull there was not remarkable in itself. What stopped him was that this skull had teeth in the upper jaw and the lower jaw both. Baleen whales have no teeth at all. Modern sperm whales have functional teeth only in the lower jaw, and the largest of those measure about 25 centimeters. The teeth in that block are over 36 centimeters long and up to 12 across at the root. The skull is around 3 meters long and 1.9 wide, about 3/4 complete. It was described in Nature in July 2010 by Olivier Lambert and 6 colleagues, and there was an immediate naming problem. The name they had chosen was already occupied by an old synonym for a mastodon. A correction went out 6 weeks later, and the animal became Livyatan melvillei. The second half honors Herman Melville. The teeth are the reason, but here's where the skull stops being a size record and starts describing behavior. Down the sides of the largest teeth run deep vertical wear facets, worn flat where upper and lower teeth passed each other under load, along a long stretch of the crown. Teeth do not wear like that from gripping. They wear like that from shearing past each other. Add the temporal fossa, the socket that houses the muscle closing the jaw, which in this skull is longer than the entire eye region, and the anatomy stops being ambiguous. This was an animal that took pieces out of large things. The head carries one more feature, and it is the strangest of them. Livyatan has an enormous basin on top of the skull, running forward over the snout, the same architecture that holds the spermaceti organ in a living sperm whale. In the modern animal, that organ is bound up, with diving into darkness and hunting squid a kilometer down. The authors of the description argue this one was not built for that. Whatever the organ was doing in this whale, it was doing it near the surface, in daylight, in a body shaped to attack things its own size. The sea it lived in is unusually well mapped. Over 300 vertebrate specimens have been logged from that one locality. Seals, sea turtles, crocodiles, seabirds, dolphins, and baleen whales from 5 to 13 meters long, including more than 20 skeletons of a single undescribed species approaching 10. The same beds hold Megalodon teeth. 2 of the largest predators the ocean has ever produced were working the same water, on the same herds, at roughly the same time, about 10 million years ago. There is no evidence whatsoever that they fought. There is excellent evidence that they were eating the same animals. What we do not have is any direct trace of a meal. No bite marks on prey. No stomach contents. Nothing but the machinery and the company it kept. The body length given as 13.5 to 17.5 meters is extrapolated from the skull because not one bone from behind the head has ever been recovered. In 2025, a tooth over 25 centimeters long from Orange County in California was tentatively assigned to the same kind of animal. That extends the range across an ocean and adds nothing to the anatomy. Everything the world knows about the most extraordinary predatory whale ever described comes from a single head in a museum in Lima. The desert around Cerro Colorado has been walked over for more than 15 years since. It has not produced a second one. Number 3. The jawbone on the Somerset Beach. On the 28th of May, 2020, Justin Reynolds and his 11-year-old daughter, Ruby, were fossil hunting at Blue Anchor on the Somerset coast and found a piece of bone in a boulder. Later the same day, Ruby found a second, larger piece, better preserved, with a distinctive groove running along it. They contacted a paleontologist named Dean Lomax, who knew what that groove was. Over the next 2 years, the family, Lomax, and a collector named Paul de la Salle went back to that stretch of foreshore again and again, recovering the rest of the bone in fragments as the sea gave them up, until the final piece came off the beach in October 2022. Assembled, it is one bone from one side of a lower jaw. It came out in 12 pieces. It measures 145 centimeters as preserved, is incomplete at both ends, and would have been over 2 meters long intact. At its deepest, it stands 26 centimeters tall. This is not a skull. It is not a limb or a spine. It is one bone. A single element of a jaw, roughly as long as an adult human being, is tall. De La Salle had found the first bone like it in 2016 at Lilstock, 10 kilometers up the same coast. 2 of them now. 2 sites, 1 rock unit, the same enormous animal. The description was published in PLOS One in April 2024 by Lomax, De La Salle, Marcello Perillo, Justin Reynolds, Ruby Reynolds, and James Waldron. 3 of the 6 authors are amateurs. 2 of them are the family who found it. Ruby was 15 by the time her name appeared on the paper. The animal is an ichthyosaur, a marine reptile shaped like a dolphin, from a group that gave birth to live young at sea and included species with the largest eyes of any known vertebrate. The size estimate is the part that needs care. The bone carries a ridge where a jaw muscle attached, 19 centimeters tall. In a well-studied relative 5.4 meters long, that same ridge measures 3.5 to 4 centimeters. That is a factor of about 5. 5 times a 5-meter ichthyosaur gives roughly 25 meters, and a second comparison against a different species returned the same answer. The authors are explicit that this is an estimate from fragmentary remains, that more complete material is needed, and that isolated bones demand caution. 25 meters is a calculation, not a measurement. It would still make this the largest marine reptile ever formally described, in the size range of a blue whale. What makes the Somerset bone genuinely haunting is not the length. It is the microscope work. Marcello Perillo, then at the University of Bonn, cut a section from a fragment and read the tissue. In a mature animal, growth slows and then stops, and the outer bone records that as a dense band laid down at the surface. There is no such band here. The outer cortex is primary bone, still open, still vascular, still carrying canals that feed tissue, actively being built. The largest marine reptile anyone has ever described was still growing when it died. It was not an adult. Nobody has any idea how big the adults were. The rock supplies the last detail. These bones come from the Westbury Mudstone, from the very end of the Triassic, about 202 million years ago. The end-Triassic mass extinction is recorded in the formation lying immediately above them. Volcanism on a continental scale, as the Atlantic began to open, is the leading explanation for it. The giant ichthyosaurs do not appear on the other side. Their descendants carried on for another 100 million years, reached 10 or 12 meters, and never came close to this again. There are older bones in Bristol from a cliff at Ast, on the Severn estuary, that may belong to the same kind of animal. They were catalogued first as an amphibian, then as dinosaur limb bones. A German researcher suggested in 1912 that they were ichthyosaur and was ignored for a century. 2 of those specimens were destroyed in 1940. Scaled the same way, one of the survivors returns a figure over 30 meters, which the authors themselves call very speculative, and which can never now be checked against the 2 bones the war took. Number 2, Mosasaurus Hoffmani. Under the town of Maastricht in the Netherlands, a hill of soft, yellow limestone has been quarried since Roman times, much of it from galleries driven horizontally into the rock. In the late 1770s, workers in one of those tunnels broke into a skull over a meter long. The land above belonged to a cathedral canon named Theodorus Goding, so the fossil was his. A retired army surgeon in the town, Johann Leonard Hoffmann, took an intense interest in it and wrote to naturalists across Europe about it. He thought it was a crocodile. The anatomist Petrus Camper laid a crocodile jaw beside the drawings and showed him it was not. The skull was worth arguing over. The jaws carry finely serrated teeth with a distinctive pattern of prisms on the outer face. They were replaced continuously through life. A new tooth grew inside the root of the old one and pushed it out, a process that took something over 500 days per tooth. Set back on the roof of the mouth is a second row of teeth, 8 per side, mounted on the palate itself. That arrangement belongs to lizards and snakes, not to crocodiles, not to whales. It is a ratchet for walking prey backwards down the throat, and it is the detail that eventually gave the animal away. In November 1794, the French Revolutionary Army took Maastricht after a 6-week siege. Within days, the skull was removed from Goding's house on the orders of the commanding general of the besieging army, carried off by a political commissioner sent for the purpose, and shipped to Paris, where it arrived the following year. It never came back. There's a famous story attached to the taking of it. 600 bottles of wine were offered as a reward, and 12 grenadiers produced the fossil the next day and collected. That story comes from one man, a French commissioner named Fauget de Saint-Fond, who published it in 1799 and who was a documented embellisher. Historians have found no archival support for the wine, and none for the lawsuit he also described. What the record does support is simpler and worse. A private citizen's property was taken by armed men in an occupied town, and a charming anecdote was published about it afterwards. In Paris, the skull met the one man in Europe equipped to read it. Adrien Gilles Camper, the anatomist's son, identified it in 1800 as a giant marine lizard, and Georges Cuvier confirmed that reading in 1808. Cuvier had already argued that mammoths were not living elephants, and that species could be lost from the world entirely. But a mammoth looks like an elephant. It can be filed under something familiar, and quietly imagined still alive in some unexplored country. This animal could not be filed anywhere. It was a marine lizard, longer than a house, with a second set of teeth in the roof of its mouth. Nothing alive resembled it. Extinction stopped being an argument between naturalists. It became an object in a room in Paris. The genus was named in 1822 after the river at Maastricht, lizard of the Meuse. The species name came in 1829, honoring the surgeon who never owned it. Modern length estimates disagree sharply. They run from about 11 or 12 meters up to 17. The larger figures depend on a jaw-to-body ratio proposed in 1967 and never properly justified. Chemistry of the bone in related mosasaurs indicates they held their temperature above the water around them. The tailbones bend downward near the end, in the way that supports a large swimming fin, and a close relative has been found with the outline of that fin preserved in the rock. Mosasaurus lived until the last day of the Cretaceous and died in the asteroid impact, 66 million years ago. And the stage of geological time that ends with that impact is called the Maastrichtian, named in 1849 after the chalk of this one hill. The final chapter of the Age of Reptiles is named after a quarry in the Netherlands because of a skull that was carried out of it under armed guard. That skull is in Paris now, in a glass case, and it is an extraordinary thing to stand in front of. You are a meter away from the animal that taught our species that the world has ended before. Number 1. The Megalodon. In 1666, fishermen off the Tuscan coast landed an enormous shark, and the Grand Duke had the head sent to a Danish anatomist working in Florence, Nicholas Steno. Steno dissected it and published the following year. What interested him was not the shark. It was that the shark's teeth were identical in every structural detail to the objects called tungstones, which were dug by the thousand out of the rock of Malta and sold as charms against poison. Steno concluded that the tungstones were teeth. Objects sealed inside solid rock could be the remains of once living animals, which meant rock had a history, and the history could be read. Some of those Maltese tungstones were the teeth of Otodus megalodon. That is how this animal entered human knowledge. As a puzzle that helped invent geology, almost 2 centuries before anyone worked out what had shed them. The teeth run up to about 18 centimeters from tip to root corner. A large great white tooth is about 5. They are triangular, thick, symmetrical, serrated all the way to the edge, and they turn up on 5 continents in marine rock roughly 20 to 3.5 million years old. They are also, very nearly, all there is. Sharks are built from cartilage. Cartilage almost never fossilizes, so there is no megalodon skeleton anywhere on Earth. The most important specimen in the world is a string of 141 vertebral centra collected in Belgium in the 1860s, from an animal that died at about 46 years old. Everything we think we know about the size and shape of the largest shark that ever lived is reconstructed from teeth and that one backbone. In 2022, a team led by Jack Cooper and Catalina Pimiento built a 3-dimensional model around that vertebral column and published it in Science Advances. Their animal is 16 meters long and over 61 tons. Its stomach holds around 10,000 liters. It cruises at 1.4 meters per second, needs over 98,000 kilocalories a day, and can swallow prey up to 8 meters long whole, which is to say an entire killer whale. After a meal that size, it could cross an ocean basin without feeding again. But here is where the reconstruction breaks. In 2024, a team led by Philip Stearns and Kenshu Shimada made one simple observation about the Belgian specimen. Laid out with the spacing it would have had in life, that vertebral column alone measures about 11.1 meters. Scaling the same individual from great white proportions returns a total body length of 9.2. An animal cannot be shorter than its own backbone, so the great white was the wrong template, and the real body was longer and more slender, closer in build to the big filter-feeding sharks than to a scaled-up mako. Their paper deliberately offers no replacement number. A follow-up in 2025 put the maximum possible length, near 24 meters, and the mass around 94 tons, as an upper bound rather than a normal adult. What it ate is not in dispute, because that evidence is written on the prey. Ribs and vertebrae of small baleen whales from Peru carry serrated gouges matching megalodon dentition. Seal bones from the same beds carry them too. A whale vertebra from Maryland has a fracture from a bite, a tooth broken off in the wound, and bone that had begun to grow back over the damage. That whale swam away and lived for weeks afterwards. In 2023, a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences used clumped isotopes in tooth enamel to take the animal's temperature. Megalodon ran about 7 degrees Celsius warmer than the water it swam in, at roughly 27 degrees, well above the fish and turtles from the same beds and above the great whites of the same period. It was not warm-blooded in the way we are. It was warm in the way a mako is, heating the muscles that mattered, and that heat is most likely what let it grow that large and hunt from the tropics into cold, temperate water. It also cost. A warm 60-ton predator carries an enormous daily energy bill, and this one was tied to warm coastal seas where the large prey lived. In the Pliocene, that world contracted. The oceans cooled, sea levels fell, and the coastal shallows drained. The mid-sized whales it depended on declined and moved. Somewhere in the same window, the great white appeared, and zinc isotopes in the teeth of both animals show them feeding at a similar level in the food web, in the same water. The authors of that study are careful to say that overlap is not proof of competition, and that no single cause explains the extinction. What kills something that can cross an ocean on one meal? Nothing dramatic. A slow subtraction of everything it was built around. The date itself moved recently, and how it moved is instructive. A 2014 study using the fossil record put the end at about 2.6 million years ago. In 2019, a team went back through the youngest specimens and found that many were reworked. Teeth eroded out of older rock and redeposited in younger, showing abrasion and cracking. Some of them dated by nothing more than the assumption that Megalodon was there. They discarded a quarter of the occurrences, revised the ages of most of the rest, and moved the extinction back to around 3.6 million years ago. It went before the broader turnover of marine mammals, not with it. It went first. We can be certain it is gone, and the certainty comes from the teeth. Sharks shed teeth continuously, in the thousands, for their entire lives. A surviving population would be carpeting the seafloor with fresh ones, and not a single tooth younger than the Pliocene has ever been found anywhere. Nothing alive carries bite marks that size. And it was a warm water animal, which rules out the deep ocean, the one place people like to imagine it still hiding. Its absence rearranged the sea. The researchers who modeled it argue that removing a transoceanic predator of that mass changed how nutrients moved between regions and released large whales from a pressure they had been under for millions of years. The largest animals in the history of life on this planet are alive right now, in the ocean this thing left behind. The teeth still come out of the ground. They wash out of the Calvert Cliffs in Maryland, and the rivers of the Carolinas, and the phosphate beds of Morocco. They are heavy in the hand and cold, and the serrations are still sharp enough to cut skin after 3 million years underground. Every one of them was shed by a living animal during an ordinary week of feeding and dropped onto a seafloor that is now dry land, or a riverbed, or a working quarry. That is the entire animal. A tooth in your palm, a column of vertebrae in Belgium, and an ocean that reorganized itself around the gap. Everything else it had was cartilage, and cartilage does not keep. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.